Welcome to another deep dive with me. Today we're going to be looking at excerpts from Build a Castle.
Okay.
And this is a really fascinating document, I think. It
Yeah.
presents a perspective on Canada's history and identity that's pretty different from what you usually hear.
Yeah, it's definitely unique.
Yeah. And I was really struck by how strongly the author feels that Canada was once, like, good in every way,
Right.
but it's since kind of lost its way,
Hmm.
especially after embracing what they call this internationalist viewpoint.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this whole thing. What do you make of that internationalist
So
label?
it seems like by internationalists, the author's talking about Canada getting involved in global affairs,
Yeah.
things like the UN trade agreements, that sort of thing.
Right.
They seem to think that by focusing on these relationships outside of Canada, it's diluted our core identity and purpose.
Mm.
It's like they want to go back to a Canada that's more inward focused,
Right.
one that prioritizes its own internal stuff and preserving its culture.
Yeah. And that idea of Canada straying from its core identity seems tied to this whole concept of a golden age, where
Yes.
everything was perfect in their view.
Right.
And the way they describe early settlers as a lordly group of people,
Yes,
that really gives you a sense of what they consider ideal.
it does. You've hit the nail on the head there. They seem to be romanticizing a past where Canadians were united by a shared Weltanschauung, a philosophy of life, if you will, and a telos, a sense of purpose.
Yeah.
Even with all the internal conflicts that were happening back then,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder if this unity they talk about was real or just selective memory.
Right.
What do you think? Did Canadians really have this unified worldview even back then?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Especially because even when talking about this golden age, the author does admit there were internal conflicts,
Exactly.
which makes me question just how inclusive this Weltanschauung really was,
Right.
especially when you look at what they say about freedom and equality.
Yeah, their views on that are something else.
They're pretty striking, to say the least,
Yeah.
to actually say that equality is the ruin of liberty.
That's a big statement.
It is. It challenges some pretty fundamental principles of modern-day Canada.
It does.
So what's your take on that?
To really understand it, I think
Mhm.
we need to look at how the author defines these concepts.
Okay.
They believe that real freedom is something you're born with.
Inherent.
Yeah, inherent,
Yeah.
not something the law gives you.
Hmm.
And this leads them to a very controversial conclusion that some people are just born freer than others.
Right.
It's a hierarchical view of freedom,
Huh?
really different from the idea that equality is a fundamental right for everyone.
Yeah. And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a bit problematic,
Definitely.
especially when we look at the author's views on the U.S. and Canada's indigenous population.
Yes.
They seem to be saying that Americans weren't really fit for freedom,
Right.
that they kind of stole it,
Yeah.
which contrasts with how they see Canada as naturally inclined towards liberty.
Hmm.
But then they also argue that indigenous peoples in Canada don't have the same level of freedom as other Canadians.
Right.
And they use the Indian Act of 1876 to support that.
It's a contradiction, isn't it?
It seems like it, yeah.
It highlights how complex their argument really is. They idealize this hierarchical past
Mhm.
where freedom was inherent but also unequally distributed.
Right.
This view shapes how they see both the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
which they think corrupted the whole idea of freedom, and
Yeah.
how they see Canada's indigenous population, whose historical treatment they fit into this hierarchy of inherent liberty. It definitely challenges modern Canadian values
It does.
and our understanding of equality as a fundamental right.
Yeah, and this leads us to a very sensitive topic,
Yes.
the residential school system.
A very dark chapter in our history.
Definitely. The author acknowledges the negative consequences of the program,
Right.
but still believes that its goal, which was assimilation, was noble.
Yes.
It's a stance I think many would struggle to accept.
Absolutely. It's important to look at that statement within the context of the author's overall worldview.
Okay.
They seem to believe that a unified Weltanschauung is super important for a nation to be strong and have a clear identity,
Right.
and they see assimilation as a way to achieve that unity, even if it comes at a cost.
Uh-huh.
Of course, this ignores the immense cultural and personal damage caused by the residential school system.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how a noble goal can have terrible consequences when it disregards the basic rights and freedoms of individuals.
Absolutely. So we're seeing a pattern here.
It seems like it.
The author romanticizes a past where freedom was prioritized,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't equally distributed.
Right.
And they see this inherent inequality as natural,
Yeah.
even necessary for a strong and unified Canada.
Yes.
But this view clashes with modern Canadian values,
Really.
especially our focus on equality and human rights.
Absolutely.
It's a tension that runs throughout this whole document.
For sure.
And speaking of tension, the author also blames Canada's decline on,
On Pat.
well, our neighbors to the South American influence.
Ah, yes. They see American influence as this corrosive force, turning Canada into just a resource colony and market, weakening our industry and eroding our cultural identity.
Right.
They point to specific examples like what happened with the Canadian aerospace industry, specifically Avro,
Right.
and the weakening of the Canadian military. It's like
Yeah.
they see Canada's unique identity being slowly absorbed by American culture and economic power.
And that fear of assimilation, of losing a distinct Canadian identity,
Mm-hmm.
that's central to their whole argument, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It ties back to their yearning for a return to tradition, to a time when Canada was supposedly more unified and independent.
Okay.
This is where their criticism of figures like Donald Trump comes in.
Right.
While they clearly don't like Trump and his policies, they also see joining the U.S. as a betrayal of Canadian heritage. They compare it to the story of Esau selling his birthright for temporary comfort.
Right.
It's a powerful analogy.
It is.
It underscores their belief in the importance of keeping a distinct Canadian identity,
Yeah.
even if it means facing economic challenges or political disagreements.
Yeah.
They believe that giving in to American influence would be like losing that inherent Canadianness they value so much.
So while they're critical of the U.S., their real fear is the loss of a unique Canadian identity.
Exactly. It's not just about economics or politics. It's about something deeper, something more fundamental to who they believe Canadians are or should be.
And this brings us to their views on leadership,
Yes,
which they see as central to restoring Canada's golden age. They have a very specific idea of what makes a good leader,
They do.
one rooted in spiritual well-being and a connection to tradition.
Yes. Their vision of leadership goes beyond just being good at politics. They believe leaders are responsible for the spiritual well-being of their people, almost like shepherds guiding their flock towards a higher purpose. They even use this fascinating anecdote about a wicked king who unintentionally led his people to salvation
Okay.
just by appearing to be pious. It's a story that highlights their belief that how a leader appears and how much they stick to tradition can have a huge impact, regardless of their true intentions.
It's a unique perspective.
It is.
So how does this apply to Canada's current political landscape?
Wow.
They specifically mention Pierre Poilievre,
Yes.
saying he lacks genuine beliefs
Right.
and would just conform to whoever's in power.
They're looking for a leader with a strong moral compass, someone who embodies traditional Canadian values and can inspire a sense of shared purpose, like those lordly settlers they admire so much. They criticize Poilievre for what they see as a lack of authenticity and conviction,
Okay.
suggesting he cares more about political convenience than real belief.
Right.
This critique reflects their overall desire for a leader who embodies the traditional values they see as essential for Canada's revival.
And this leads us to maybe the most provocative claim of this whole document,
Which is?
that Canadians have become unworthy of good leaders.
That's a harsh assessment.
It is.
Okay.
What do you think they mean by that, and how does it connect to their overall argument?
It seems like their disillusionment with modern Canada extends to its people, too. They believe Canadians have lost that aristocratic spirit, that sense of duty and responsibility they associate with the nation's golden age.
Okay.
They argue that this decline in personal virtue has created a void in leadership
Interesting.
because people are no longer capable of recognizing or supporting truly virtuous leaders.
So it's a cyclical thing.
Exactly. A decline in personal virtue leads to a decline in leadership, which in turn perpetuates the cycle of decline.
Right, so it's not just about finding the right leader. It's about transforming ourselves.
Yes.
About reclaiming that aristocratic spirit
Yes.
that they believe is essential for a strong and unified Canada.
Right.
And this brings us to the author's call to action, which is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
They urge Canadians to build citadels or castles to preserve truth and beauty.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It is. What do you make of that metaphor?
It sums up their entire argument.
Okay.
These castles represent a retreat from what they see as the negative forces of entropy, modernity, and sin.
Okay.
Forces that they believe are corrupting Canada's identity. But these castles aren't just physical structures.
Right.
They represent a personal and cultural fortification,
Okay.
a commitment to traditional values, and a rejection of what they see as the corrupting influences of modern society.
So it's not just about retreating from the world.
Yeah.
It's about building something new,
Exactly.
something rooted in tradition and personal virtue.
Yes.
But this raises a crucial question. Can building personal castles actually influence the future of a nation?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Because the author's call to action has big implications for how we view our role as individuals in shaping the future of Canada.
Right.
It's a complex and challenging idea,
It is.
one that makes us confront our own values and beliefs about what it means to be Canadian in the 21st century.
I can't wait to unpack that further with you. Join us for the next part of this deep dive as we explore the author's concluding thoughts and grapple with the implications of their vision for Canada's future.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into Build a Castle. As we dig deeper into the author's call to action,
Yeah.
I think it's worth revisiting that striking image they use building these citadels or castles to protect truth and beauty.
It is such a vivid metaphor, isn't it?
It is.
This idea of creating these personal fortresses to withstand the pressures of modern society.
Right.
But I'm also struck by this sense of, isolation.
Yeah.
Does the author imagine these castles as solitary things? Or is there room for community, for some kind of collective action?
That's the key question, I think. While they emphasize individual transformation, they don't completely dismiss the importance of community.
Right.
Remember their idea of a shared Weltanschauung?
Yeah.
It suggests a longing for like-minded people to come together to maybe build those castles, not in isolation,
Okay.
but as interconnected strongholds of tradition. Think of medieval cities, individual houses fortified,
Right.
but still part of a larger protective wall.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about being completely isolated,
Yeah.
but about creating spaces where traditional values can be preserved
Yes.
and shared with others who believe the same things.
Exactly. And this connects to another key part of their call to action,
Okay.
the emphasis on conquering the world inside you.
Right.
It's about personal transformation, striving for spiritual and moral excellence as the foundation for building those metaphorical castles.
So they're suggesting that individual change is necessary for societal change.
Yes.
By perfecting ourselves.
Right.
By embodying those traditional values they hold dear,
Exactly.
we can somehow create a ripple effect
Yeah.
that transforms Canada as a whole.
Precisely. And this links back to what they said earlier about leadership.
Right.
They seem to believe that a society made up of virtuous individuals will naturally attract and support virtuous leaders.
It's an idealistic vision,
It is.
but is it realistic?
That's what I'm struggling with.
Me too.
While I appreciate the focus on personal responsibility,
Right.
I'm also wondering about the practical side of things.
Yeah.
The author doesn't really give concrete steps beyond this general call to build a castle. It's all very philosophical.
It is.
But how does this translate into real-world change?
Right. How do we go from building metaphorical castles to dealing with the complex issues facing Canada today?
That's where we might hit some limitations in the author's perspective.
Okay.
They're great at identifying what they see as Canada's problems,
Uh-huh.
but the solutions they offer are more abstract. They seem to be banking on this trickle-down effect,
Okay.
believing that individual virtue will automatically lead to a better society. But history shows us that systemic change often needs more than just individual goodwill.
Yeah. You're right. It's easy to romanticize the past and call for a return to traditional values.
Yes.
But how do we actually apply those values to the challenges of the 21st century?
Exactly.
Issues like climate change, economic inequality, social justice,
Yeah.
these require systemic solutions,
They do.
not just individual acts of virtue.
It's like they're offering a very individualistic answer to problems that are inherently collective.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
And that leads to another important question. Who is this message even for? Who is the author trying to reach with this build a castle idea?
It seems like they're speaking to a very specific group of people.
Okay.
People who share their disillusionment with modern society, their longing for a return to traditional values, and their belief in the power of personal virtue.
Right. People who feel like Canada has lost its way
Yeah.
and that the answer lies in going back to a romanticized past
Exactly. And while that message might resonate with some,
Uh-huh.
it could also alienate others.
Right.
If you don't share the author's worldview,
Yeah.
their arguments might not be convincing or even be offensive.
Mm-mm.
Consider their statement that some people are born freer than others.
Right.
Or their comments on Canada's Indigenous population in residential schools.
Yeah,
These are views that many Canadians would strongly disagree with.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it shows how important it is to engage with these ideas critically.
Yes.
We can't just accept them at face value.
No.
We need to think about their implications and compare them to other perspectives.
Right.
Even if we disagree with the author, their work can make us think more deeply about our own values and beliefs.
Exactly. This deep dive isn't about blindly agreeing or disagreeing with the author.
Right.
It's about using their perspective as a starting point for our own exploration of Canadian history and identity and the challenges we face as a nation. It's about asking ourselves difficult questions about what it means to be Canadian in the 21st century.
And recognizing that there are multiple perspectives on these complex issues.
Yes. What might resonate with one person could be really unsettling for another.
Exactly. And as we move into the last part of our discussion, I think it's crucial to keep that in mind.
I agree.
The author's concluding thoughts on leadership and their vision for the future of Canada are both thought-provoking and challenging.
They are.
They offer a unique viewpoint,
Yes.
but one that requires careful consideration and critical analysis.
Well said.
Well, I'm ready to delve into those concluding thoughts.
Okay.
I'm especially interested in how the author reconciles their call for individual transformation with the need for collective action.
Right.
Can we really change the world one castle at a time? Or do we need a more systemic approach?
Those are the questions that will guide our final exploration. Join us as we unpack the author's vision for the future of Canada and wrestle with the implications of their call to action.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. As we wrap up this exploration of Build a Castle, I'm still thinking about the author's statement that Canadians are unworthy of good leaders.
It's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It's a harsh critique.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what it says about their overall vision for the future of Canada.
I think it really gets to the core of their argument, you know?
Yep.
Remember that analogy they used about a declining aristocracy?
Right.
It's like they're saying Canadians have lost that sense of nobility and responsibility,
Right.
that aristocratic spirit that they think is so important for a strong and virtuous society.
And it all ties back to their belief that a decline in personal virtue has led to a decline in leadership.
Exactly.
Like it's this cycle.
Right.
Canadians need to get back that aristocratic spirit before they can hope to find and support truly virtuous leaders.
That's what they seem to be saying.
So the author's vision for Canada's future really depends on this idea of personal transformation,
Right.
leading to societal change.
Yes. They believe that by focusing on these traditional values, like duty, honor, and commitment to truth and beauty,
Right.
Canadians can break free from this cycle of decline
Okay.
and create a more virtuous and prosperous nation.
But how does that actually happen? They tell readers to build these citadels or castles of tradition,
Right.
but what does that even look like in real life?
Yeah.
Is it about withdrawing from society,
Mm-hmm.
creating these little pockets of virtue?
That's the question, isn't it?
Or is there something more outward-facing to their vision?
While the author stresses personal responsibility in keeping tradition alive, they don't necessarily say people should completely isolate themselves.
Okay.
Remember how they talked about a shared Weltanschauung?
Yeah.
It suggests that they want like-minded people to come together
Right.
to form communities where those traditional values can be upheld and taught to future generations.
So it's not just about building individual castles.
No.
It's about creating a network of interconnected fortresses.
Yeah.
Almost a cultural landscape where those values can flourish.
Exactly.
And maybe even influence the wider society.
Right. And this leads us to a key tension in the author's argument.
Okay.
The balance between individual transformation and collective action. They clearly believe that personal change is vital, but they also acknowledge the need for a shared vision,
Right.
a collective commitment to those traditional values they see as essential for Canada's revival.
So they're asking us to look inward,
Yes.
to cultivate our own sense of virtue and responsibility,
Right.
but also to connect with others who share those values.
To build communities that can counter the negative forces they see in modern society.
And this is where I struggle with the implications of their argument.
Okay.
I appreciate their emphasis on personal growth and preserving tradition.
Yes.
But I wonder if focusing on individual castles misses the systemic problems
Hmm.
that contribute to many of the issues the author talks about.
Right. Can we really tackle things like economic inequality or climate change
Yeah.
just by becoming more virtuous as individuals?
Or do we need a more collective, more politically active approach?
That's the big question.
It is. Can individual change lead to societal change?
Right.
Are those two things separate?
The author seems to think that personal virtue will naturally lead to better leadership and a more virtuous society. But is that realistic?
It's something each listener will have to think about for themselves.
I agree.
The author's vision for Canada is both inspiring and challenging.
It is.
It calls for a deep commitment to personal growth
Right.
and a re-engagement with traditional values.
Yes.
But it also raises tough questions about how much individuals can actually do
Uh-huh.
when faced with complex societal problems.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
It really is.
Build a Castle isn't just a document. It's a conversation starter.
I like that.
It makes us examine our own beliefs about what it means to be Canadian, to think about our role in shaping our nation's future, and to grapple with the tension between individual transformation and collective action.
And to recognize that there are many different perspectives on these complex issues.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I encourage everyone listening to continue this conversation,
Yes.
to reflect on the author's ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and to think about how their own values and beliefs line up with the vision presented in Build a Castle.
Because in the end, the future of Canada won't be determined by any one document or ideology.
Right.
It'll be shaped by the combined efforts of individuals who are willing to have these important conversations and work together towards a shared vision of a just and thriving society.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.